understand why there are Russian tanks today in the Ukraine, you have no further to go than look at who our UN ambassador is that's supposed to intimidate the Russians. Your UN ambassador, any ambassador, is a representation of the President of the United States. If that individual cannot speak with authority, if that individual cannot represent the interests of the United States with strength, then no country will respect you. We didn't have that problem while we had Ambassador Bolton representing us in the UN. We had an incredible representative for the interests of the United States. And for me, I can't think of another reason why I could even remotely want to support the United States without having a guy like Ambassador Bolton as our representative. But let me just tell you, this morning, I am so looking forward to this with everything that's happening in the world of foreign affairs, with our nation as we are slowly starting to undo the defense of our country under the current administration, as all of Europe now starts to revert back to politics of the Kaiser and World War I. We need voices like Ambassador Bolton to lead our party, to give us guidance, and to tell us where the real dangers lie and how we have to plan for the future. And so without further ado or delay, let me introduce one of the greatest minds in foreign affairs, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, Ambassador John Bolton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back in New Hampshire, and thanks very much for the kind introduction. It's great to see all of the Northeast region here. Being introduced by the chairman of the D.C. Republican Party compels me to tell you I was born and raised in Maryland. I still live in Maryland. So like the Republicans in D.C., I know what a one-party state is like. You have a distinct advantage in New Hampshire of being in a competitive place, but also obviously because of the attention that New Hampshire gets every 4 years and really continuously now. The voters of New Hampshire have a unique role in helping direct the political process in the United States. And I want to talk about some of the challenges facing the United States internationally, but I think it's important to start with the challenge that we face here in the United States when it comes to dealing with national security policy. You know, you'll listen to a lot of political operatives, Republican and Democrat alike, who will tell you that foreign policy doesn't matter to the voters, they don't care about it, it doesn't touch their daily lives, it's too far away. I happen to think that's not true. I think the American citizenry is very practical. I think they understand the relationship between domestic policy and international policy. I think they know our freedom and our way of life here at home depends on a strong American presence in the world. And they understand that American weakness internationally can contribute in very dramatic ways to undermining our way of life here at home. And they do not buy the argument that just because something's happening in a place they may not be familiar with, that it's not going to have an effect on them. You know, I think the attitude that foreign policy doesn't matter was best summed up some years back by a politician who basically asked why we're so worried, as he put it, because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. That was Neville Chamberlain speaking days before the Munich Agreement in 1938, and of course the country was Czechoslovakia, which is a lot closer to the United Kingdom than it is to us. That's the attitude of politicians that eventually gets us into trouble. And as we meet today, we can see trouble all over the world, whether it's Ukraine, the Middle East, or now this tragedy of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, which the Prime Minister of Malaysia said this morning they now believe clearly was hijacked or was the victim of some terrorist act. These are things that are happening whether our politicians talk about them or not. And the question is, if we're not concerned about them, will we be ready when the United States faces the next challenge? And the real problem, I think, in our country today, it's not that voters are not concerned about national security policy. It's that fundamentally the President of the United States is not concerned about American national security policy. I think there are a variety of reasons for this. I think part of it, he told us very clearly in the 2008 campaign. He said, in his words, he wanted to fundamentally transform America. That's certainly what he's trying to do with his every waking moment. And so from his perspective, foreign and defense policy are distractions. They're unwanted diversions from implementing Obamacare, implementing Dodd-Frank, implementing a very intrusive regulatory system across the board of all the regulatory agencies, changing our immigration laws, really changing laws by executive fiat. And I think the President really confronts international affairs only when he has no real choice or when he can take political credit for it. I think, and I think we've got to be straight with ourselves on this, that in addition to the inattention, there is an ideology at work here. I think the President believes that the United States is too strong, too assertive, too dominant, too present in the world, and that in fact it's our role internationally that causes many of the international difficulties that we see. He said in the State of the Union address back in January that long-term American troop deployments can contribute to extremism, which is the word he uses instead of terrorism, because after all, in his universe, terrorism doesn't exist anymore. That's an incredible statement by a President of the United States. Obviously not true. I don't think our long-term deployments in Germany and Japan have contributed to extremism. I think they've contributed to stable, democratic American allies, as you would expect from our young men and women in uniform. But the President, to me, it's analogous to what he said famously to Joe the plumber in the 2008 campaign. Remember, he told Joe it's a good thing to spread the wealth around. I think the President internationally thinks it's a good thing to spread the power around a little bit. The United States being too powerful causes problems. And he's said this in several different ways. In his first speech to the United Nations, in 2009, he said the following: "No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will succeed. No balance of power among nations will hold." Now, when I first heard that, I thought, well, what's he talking about? Is he talking about the Soviet Union? What's he referring to? And then it occurred to me when he said, "No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will succeed." He was talking about us. He was talking about us. His view is that we are too strong, that American strength itself is provocative, so that a declining, withdrawing, non-assertive America actually makes the world safer. I think that's like looking through the wrong end of a telescope, but that is the Obama ideology. He's not the only person in America to believe it. He happens to be the first one who got elected president. I think his views are entirely consonant with conversations in the faculty lounges of our great universities. I think that's where he picked it up to begin with. And I think that earlier Democratic candidates for president had the same view. In 2004, John Kerry, Secretary of State now of all things, proposed a global test for American policy, basically whether we could get it approved by the UN Security Council. In 1988, George H.W. Bush said of his opponent, Michael Dukakis, "My opponent sees the United States as just another pleasant country out there on the United Nations roll call, somewhere between Albania and Zimbabwe." I think that's Obama's view too. He just doesn't see the United States as a truly exceptional nation. Now, he denies that, but his policies bear it out. I think also we've got a problem on the Republican side, in part because of this idea that political operatives say that nobody cares about foreign policy. I've never really understood that. It's like people don't fill their gasoline tanks up in their car occasionally. You don't think about the price of gasoline and where it comes from. But it's also because today we've seen I think collectively a failure of our leadership to take the president on this very important issue of national security, of failing to explain to the American people what's at stake. I think the people would listen. I think they would respond to it. I think honestly, as an early supporter of Governor Romney, that we made a mistake in 2012 by not emphasizing national security more. And I think especially now, as we see within our own party a rising tide of, let's be blunt, a rising tide of isolationism, it's important to counter that. Now, there are examples of people who did it. Pete King is here today. I'm very glad that he's here. You'll hear from him later today. He's been very important in making these arguments, but we need a lot more. We need a lot more people in the House and the Senate. We need people all over the country to be concerned about these issues. And I don't think, and I think it's important to stress, what issue is more important than the security of our country? You know, even the most libertarian among us, and I consider myself pretty libertarian, should remember what Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, the handbook of free market economics. Adam Smith said, the first duty of the sovereign is to protect the society against the violence of other societies. If you can't do that, all of the other issues you discuss become secondary. And for politicians and the political operatives who talk to them, if the security of our country is not something on which you're prepared to stake your political future, then what is? That's why voters in New Hampshire are so important. If you ask the candidates what their views are on national security, how to protect America internationally, how to look after our interest around the world, how to be supportive of our allies, they're going to listen and they're going to respond. And if we've learned one among many lessons from the increasingly failed presidency of Barack Obama, it's that somebody who comes into the office with essentially no experience in foreign or defense policy and finds it necessary to do on-the-job training is going to leave us in a much more vulnerable position, without question. And I think the record of the last 5 years demonstrates that. And I'll just take a few examples here that make the point that I've been trying to make about Obama's very misbegotten view of America's place in the world. Let's start with Russia. You know, I don't know what you need as a kind of laboratory case study of failed American foreign policy than to look at what Vladimir Putin is doing today in the Ukraine and what he has planned in the space of the former Soviet Union and more broadly. The Obama administration came in with the view that our relations with Russia were bad and that he would press the so-called reset button and everything would be fine. It never seemed to have occurred to Obama that our relations with Russia were bad because of the policies that Russia was pursuing. And indeed, there couldn't have been a clearer example of that than in August of 2008 during the campaign when Russia invaded Georgia. Now, Russia had been involved in destabilizing Georgia for quite some time, but this was the first use of military force across an international border among the republics of the former Soviet Union. Russian troops moved to within 30 miles of the capital. They bombed the suburbs of the capital. They hived off two provinces of Georgia that they still control. And candidate Obama said at the time, as the massive Russian army is invading Georgia, a dot on the map, candidate Obama called on both sides to exercise restraint. Now, that's like the principal of the school telling the schoolyard bully to stop picking on the 98-pound weakling. What do you mean both sides should exercise restraint? But I think in the Kremlin, they wrote those words down very carefully, and they watched then what Obama did since then, canceling our missile defense bases for missiles and radars in Poland and the Czech Republic, facilities that were designed to protect the American homeland, not from Russia, but from ballistic missile attacks from Iraq and Iran. We gave them the New START Arms Control Treaty, a disastrously insufficient treaty from the U.S.'s point of view. We made many other concessions, and the Russian government, in classic Soviet-era style, took every concession we made, put it in their pocket, and said, "What have you got for me now?" And obligingly, Obama kept giving it to them. And the response from the Kremlin is the military incursion into the Crimea and Putin's obvious effort to gain hegemony over the Ukraine and all of the other republics. He said 8 years ago, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I think most of us think it was a great way to end the 20th century. That's obviously not his view, and what he's trying to do is reestablish Russian sway. He's got a strategy. He knows what he wants. He's calculated the cost and the benefits. What's our response? We send John Kerry to London to negotiate with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, I've known both of these men a very long time. Sending Kerry to negotiate with Lavrov is like sending a cupcake to negotiate with a steak knife. I don't know how this will play out, but I know that American weakness and European weakness in the face of these very belligerent Russian moves virtually guarantee that Putin will continue to push and that others around the world will see again the lesson of Obama's weakness, lack of attention, lack of any kind of coherent strategy to how to protect America in the world. And other than the participants in the Ukraine crisis, nobody is watching what's happening there more carefully than China. China wants to see what the United States under Obama does when confronted with outright territorial aggression, because that's what China has in mind too. It has made extraordinary claims over islands and rocks and reefs in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. They seem like insignificant dots on the map. They are, in fact, insignificant dots on the map, except for what they represent politically and militarily. In the East China Sea, you've got disputed claims with Japan and Taiwan that have a direct impact on the defense of both of those American allies. In the South China Sea, you've got territorial claims that have an impact on natural resources, oil, gas, and others under the sea, but also control over the waters of the South China Sea. If you look at a map today, all of South Korea, Japan, Taiwan's oil comes from the Middle East through the Straits of Malacca and up the South China Sea to those countries. If China accomplishes its objective, which is to take the South China Sea and transform it from international waters to a Chinese lake, they will have their hands around the throats of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And everybody knows it. The competing territorial claims there against countries like Vietnam and the Philippines that simply can't stand up to China unless they have United States support. And yet, what is the policy of the Obama administration considering these Chinese claims? Our policy is we hope for a peaceful, negotiated resolution of the disputes. That's like saying we favor prayer to stop the Chinese assertiveness. It's just simply not a policy that's going to work. And at the same time that our Navy is shrinking to the smallest number of ships at sea since 1916, China is engaged in a massive military buildup. They've increased their nuclear weapons arsenal, their ballistic missile capability. They're modernizing the People's Liberation Army. They've got one of the most aggressive cyber warfare campaigns on the planet. They have sophisticated anti-satellite weapons to blind our eyes in the sky. They're developing what are called area denial and anti-access weapons capabilities to push the shrinking U.S. Navy back from the western shores of the Pacific. All of the countries of East Asia and Southeast Asia fear what's going to happen if America continues to withdraw. And this is under a president who said he was going to pivot from the Middle East to Asia. That's what the pivot does. In fact, the United States can't pivot. The United States has to protect its interests and its friends and allies worldwide. But China sees vulnerability here, and if it's further confirmed in the Ukraine, I think we're going to see increasing Chinese assertiveness across a wide range of issues. And in fact, it's in the Middle East where we don't have any alternative but to stay very heavily involved, that the two immediate threats I want to touch on below the strategic level of Russia and China, the two immediate threats that the administration seems blind to, and that is the continuing global assault of terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological. You know, the administration basically doesn't believe there is a war on terror anymore. That you heard the line in 2012, Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive. I don't think, unfortunately, Al-Qaeda got the memo. They have emerged stronger all across North Africa and the Middle East. We don't know much about this Malaysian Airlines hijacking yet, but it bears all the marks of international terrorism. We've seen the consequences of terrorism's renewal in Iraq, where despite all of the sacrifice the United States and its allies made, Al-Qaeda was able to take control again of Fallujah and Ramadi. We see in Afghanistan the war that Obama defended in his campaign to undercut the assertions that he was weak on national security. We see the United States planning to withdraw there. The impact will be exactly the same as the withdrawal in Iraq. Taliban and Al-Qaeda will come back to power. Afghanistan, again, will be a base for international terrorism, just as it was for planning and executing the September the 11th attacks. But it's worse this time, because if Taliban takes control in Afghanistan, it will strengthen the hand of Pakistani Taliban and other radicals in that country that could take control there, forming another base for international terrorism, but even worse, giving the terrorists control over Pakistan's substantial arsenal of nuclear weapons, perhaps 60 to 200, which would make it a global threat to the United States and its friends immediately. You never hear the president talk about that. All you hear is that the American people are weary of the war in Afghanistan. Well, I think they are weary of the war in Afghanistan because they haven't had a president who's explained it's a lot better to defend against Taliban attacks along the Afghan-Pakistan border than it is in the streets of America. I think if people understood that we are safer when we are suppressing Taliban in Afghanistan, that they would rally to support it. But if nobody's making that case, the president doesn't make that case, the Republican Party doesn't make that case, the people conclude logically, if incorrectly, that there's nothing to worry about. There's a lot to worry about, and the threat of terrorism that we've just been discussing is really amplified enormously by the progress of several rogue states toward a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. North Korea, which you never hear the administration talk about, conducted 2 more nuclear tests during this administration. All outside observers say their ballistic missile capabilities are improving, and they're going to get to the point sooner rather than later when they can squeeze down the size of their nuclear devices to fit into a warhead, to put on a ballistic missile. Can certainly reach all over East Asia, and in the not-too-distant future will reach the United States, which is why not treating the Korean threat at all is a mistake, and why reducing the Bush administration's National Missile Defense Program to a shadow of its former self is so troubling. That missile defense program is to protect us, and the Obama administration, along with its other devastating cuts in our defense budget, has confined it to a very, very small and underfunded program. But it's really Iran where the nuclear threat becomes most acute. And this is another demonstration of the administration's ethereal view of international affairs, trying to negotiate with Iran to get them to give up their nuclear weapons program. Here's the secret. Iran is never going to give up its nuclear weapons program. It's Trump card to keep the regime in power and to give it dominance in its region. The administration, along with other countries, negotiated a deal with Iran in Geneva in November, where Iran made superficial, easily reversible concessions on its nuclear program and broke through the economic sanctions that had caused a considerable amount of economic disarray in the country. Iran, make no mistake, is now on track to get nuclear weapons essentially at a time of its choosing. And it will do so unless there is preemptive military action against the program. It's a very unpleasant choice, but it's a hard reality. The United States isn't going to do it, even though the president says over and over again all options are on the table. Nobody believes him. The Iranians don't believe him. The Israelis don't believe him. Most Americans don't believe him, which is why the focus is on Israel, which twice before has struck nuclear weapons programs in hostile states. I don't know what the Israelis will do, but I think it's important that in the United States we appreciate that if Israel does strike, it will be in the exercise of its legitimate right to self-defense. And this is important as well because of the interrelationship between terrorism and nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. When Taliban and al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11, we had no hesitation to go into Afghanistan and overthrow the Taliban regime. But what if Afghanistan had had nuclear weapons before 9/11? It would have been a very different story. Iran for 30 years has been the world's central banker of international terrorism. If it gets nuclear weapons, it's not simply a case of using those weapons, but of threatening them against their neighbors and of providing impunity for terrorists that Iran could finance, arm, and train. So this interrelationship is critical. The 9/11 attack obviously was not conducted with weapons of mass destruction, but I'm very much afraid that if there is another 9/11, it will be with weapons of mass destruction. And as tragic as 9/11 was, the next wake-up call may be much, much worse. And this is where I think the Obama administration has been most woefully deficient. And I'm thinking specifically of its non-response to the murder of Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans in Benghazi. You know, Secretary Clinton made her famous comment about what difference does it make what happened in Benghazi, and this is a subject I'm sure we could all talk for hours about. I'm only going to focus on what has happened since September the 11th, 2012, and the answer there is nothing. And this is a devastating fact for the United States in the world. The U.S. ambassador in a foreign country is the president's personal representative, and the lesson that the Obama administration has taught by 18 months of inaction is that you can kill the personal representative of the president and get away with it with impunity. It is a terrible lesson for the terrorists to learn. It's a terrible lesson for the terrorists, for their state sponsors, for adversaries of the United States around the world, and it's a terrible lesson for our friends, too. Because if we're not willing to protect American citizens, what are we going to do with our allies in their time of trouble? So when you hear the administration talk about Benghazi as a phony scandal, think of what goes through the minds of people all around the world, that American ambassadors and all American citizens are vulnerable internationally. That is the kind of weakness that invites aggression. The president thinks that it's American strength that's provocative. He's 180 degrees wrong. It's American weakness that's provocative. And this long list of troubles that I've given you this morning, which I know is not the most optimistic way to start out the day, but the reason it's important to talk about it is because the president never does. And when you add them all together, and I haven't even gotten started, you can see how desperate our situation has become. And that's why the role of everybody in this room as citizens becomes so important, because you in your respective states can all go to the political aspirants at whatever level of government, but especially candidates for federal office, and demand that they explain to you what their foreign and defense policies are. And if you don't press on that, and you don't get explanations, and you don't get a chance to see the thinking, the logic, the background, the experience, the capabilities of people on international affairs, then we're going to risk getting either another Barack Obama from the Democratic Party or a Republican version of it. And that could be extraordinarily negative for the United States. So the real answer here this morning is we have a lot of work to do on this subject. The President's dug us into a deep hole over the last 5 years in budget terms and otherwise. We've got 3 more years to go. It's only going to get worse. But the salvation of the country is, as it always is, in our people. So if we insist that we want a president and members of the House and the Senate who uphold American security, who believe in our country, believe in the goodness of our country, believe that our country's strength brings peace to the world, then we can turn it around. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think before they haul me off here, we've got time for a few questions. Is that right?
We thought you didn't have time.
I know you're on a tight schedule, but
We'd love to take
yes, sir. No, because I was part of that a little bit in the Bush administration before the voters threw us out of office. The fact is, on December 31, 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, elements of the Soviet rocket forces were present in Belarus and Ukraine, but they were in no sense Ukrainian or Belarusian forces. They were Soviet forces that happened to be in a country that no longer existed. So it was in the interest of the United States and in the interest of Russia to get all those nuclear warheads back into Russia. The U.S., the U.K., and Russia made a territorial guarantee for Belarus and Ukraine, and I think that was the right thing to do. The trouble with that security guarantee is that all 3 guarantors effectively have to act unanimously for it to work. It's the same problem as the UN Security Council. If somebody's vetoing resolutions, nothing's going to happen. So obviously, in the case of Ukraine today, you have Russia saying there's no threat to territorial integrity or sovereignty in Ukraine. We're there to protect people, and it means the guarantee falls through. Yes, sir, in the back.
Saying it's the economy stupid. To me, it's the dollar stupid. China is trying to aggressively undercut the United States as the world's reserve currency. Our allies, specifically Australia, because they've lost faith in us, have negotiated an agreement with China where they bypass the dollar as reserve currency. I am very, very fearful of a complete collapse of the dollar. Would you comment, and I know you're not an economist, but certainly the way that—
But I can pretend.
But I do know Admiral Mullen, among others, has spoken out very, very strongly on the issue. And I think we have a right to demand of our next senator to know if he goes to Washington, is it going to be same old, or is it going to be someone who's going to be aggressive in attacking the budget? And I think if you might want to comment on failure to protect the dollar, what it's going to mean internationally.
No, look, I think the Obama administration has deliberately pursued a weak dollar policy, which is contrary to American interest in their view, which I don't even think economists believe anymore. A weak dollar holds down the cost of production and benefits exports. I just don't think that trade-off is anywhere near as straightforward as they seem to think it is. And in any event, a weak dollar hurts American consumers by driving up the price of oil, which is denominated internationally in dollars, raising the cost of production. A strong dollar is good for the American economy. It's good for us politically, internationally. It's something we should return to. And the idea that somehow weakening the dollar benefits us, I think, is wrong. I think actually he knows it doesn't benefit us. I think this is part of spreading the power around. Let the Chinese currency be more powerful. Let the euro be more powerful. I don't buy it.
And this last question, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Iran to give up its nuclear weapons program. Look what happened with Libya when they gave up their weapons of mass destruction program, traded it in for Nelly Furtado and 50 Cent concerts.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Iran is ever going to give up its nuclear weapons program. I don't think there's any chance of negotiating with them. I don't think that sanctions have had any effect on it. It's true that Iran came to the negotiating table, but it was to get relief from the sanctions, not to give up its nuclear weapons program. Right now, I think it's very clear in only a matter of a few years, Iran will have a very substantial stockpile of nuclear weapons unless Israel intervenes. And part of the problem is it won't stop with Iran. If they get nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will, Turkey will, and you'll soon have a Middle East with half a dozen nuclear weapon states. That's what proliferation is. That's why it's so important to stop Iran before it gets there first. And I think with 3 more years of this administration, it's a pretty grim prospect. But that's why I say, as I closed my remarks, it is critical that citizens demand of their would-be political leaders that explain their views on foreign and defense policy, explain how they're going to protect America in a difficult world. And if they have trouble with that, as your local congresswoman has had trouble doing, then you need to take the appropriate steps. Thank you very much.